I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so I thought dressing like a pimp might make it a little bit easier. I have blogs where you can read stuff and see things and interact with me. My main one is postmortemstudios.wordpress.com. My writing one and sort of diary blog is over at talesofgrim.wordpress.com. Hope to see you there. Hello all, I've read Laughter of a Scoundrel by Nick Goroff, who you may know better as Wizard of Cause on YouTube, or you may know even better as Jeff Holliday's mate on YouTube. And he does Late Night Saints and all kinds of other stuff. It's a very nice voice, I find. So before I get into the book, let's get the negative, nasty side of things out of the way first, so that people remember the good stuff rather than the bad stuff. So save it to the end. It's expensive for what you get. What's it, $12.95, and about the same in pounds in the UK for a novella, essentially, a collection of essays. And if you've listened to Nick on YouTube, then you can't help but read the book in his voice, which is actually a bit of a bonus. It's published rather than self-published through a group called Clash Books, and they are guilty of the unforgivable sin of publishing literary fiction. So, bad, Nick, bad. Literary fiction is trash. Stories that don't go anywhere aren't stories in my book. But yeah, that's about all I can say, other than it probably could have used another pass through the editor. There's a few errors here and there, and a few sort of sound-alike words with the wrong spelling, or turns of phrase like dawning should be donning, where it's used. Yeah, bits and pieces like that. So just could have used another pass through the editor, but nothing too bad. And I'm really in no position to criticise anyone on that score, because editing is one of those areas where I tend to skimp. It's kind of synchronistic that I got the book when I did, though it was a day late. I'm pretty burnt out in a kind of exhausted way. This comes through in Nick's writing, even though we're on opposite sides of the Atlantic, very different political situations, very different national situations. At the same time, there's a lot that's the same. And someone I've been working with who has had seemingly sort of boundless creativity and enthusiasm has also burnt out. And so it was kind of timely to get to read this. And being done in smaller essays, I think it suits people's lack of attention span. Yeah, I used to read voraciously. I've fallen away from it through the last few years, and so I've challenged myself to read a lot more this year. So that was on my list, and it arrived just in time as I finished another book. So Nick kind of rose to semi-prominence on YouTube during Gamergate and then the 2016 elections in the US and so on, as a sort of commentator, social commentator, political commentator, and part of the kind of skeptical anti-social justice warrior movement, if you will. See, that really came out of the whole atheist movement online, which was tied more into left-wing politics. Then there were a series of scandals and fallings out, and basically the online atheist movement split between those who were, shall we say, political atheists and those who were, shall we say, philosophical atheists. People who were atheists as part of a kind of portmanteau of their left-wing, anti-evangelical, pro-abortion sort of side of things, and those who were atheists because there's no evidence for God. And there was a clash between those two because one side of the equation started failing to apply skepticism to their political positions, whereas the other side applied skepticism equally and then got accused of being, well, you know how it all goes, accused of being racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, Nazis, you name it. So there was a bit of a falling out, and a lot of the online activity that had been there in kind of activist atheism, that kind of run its course for that generation. All the arguments had been debunked. There wasn't a lot left to work with. The evangelical right was largely out of power, so there weren't constant outrages. And that battle, that rise of pseudo-skepticism, led to a revival in skepticism that set its targets as the social justice warriors, and found a new audience in the sort of libertarian left, but also, unfortunately, increasingly on the more sort of conservative right. I think there's a lot similar about me and Nick. I think we're cut from old school left-wing cloth. We take free speech very seriously. We're economically left, anti-Puritan, anti-authoritarian, and that is a large part of what led people like me and like him to oppose this new Puritanism, this new evangelism coming from what I call the pseudo-left. People who claim to be left-wing but don't seem to actually act like it, who don't seem to embody the values of the left at all. People who claim to be against racism but are amongst the most racist motherfuckers you'll ever meet. People who claim to be against sexism but are amongst the most sexist motherfuckers you'll ever meet. I think, like me, Nick was disappointed in this rise of this puritanical, authoritarian, no fun allowed left, enthused by the backlash, and then disappointed again as that backlash failed to settle in the skeptical old school, and now I guess what you'd call the dirtbag left, and instead got caught up by the right. And then a lot of people were just pursuing that as a kind of career move. A lot of grifters latched onto it, and the vitriol poured upon any criticism of the pseudo left by the genuine left ended up pushing a lot of people towards conservative thinkers. I think, not unlike how the Democrats in the US completely abandoned their working class base, didn't even make any arguments or appeals to them. Trump did, and hoovered up their votes, even though he hasn't delivered on anything for any of them. Similarly, though less so, I think here Labour's collapse can be laid at the feet, at least in part, of cozying up to the kind of Islington, soft left, pseudo left, social justice-y types. Even though Corbyn isn't really that kind of person, I don't think he's much more old school left. Nonetheless, the taint was there, and they didn't even really bother to make the arguments to the working class per se. And just write them all off as racist and sexist and xenophobic and whatever else. And to be fair, a lot of them are, but it's not particularly helpful to make that argument. So I think, like me, Nick's been drifting a bit, judging from his video content, trying to figure out, where are we now? Where am I now? I don't fit in with this pseudo-left. I don't fit in with this new right. I don't want to grift. I want to be honest. My politics are still left-wing. It's hard to figure out where you are. Politically homeless is a kind of hackneyed phrase, but it applies. And I think also, like me, Nick has had a kind of varied career of doing various precarious things in arts and so on, and an interest in politics and an involvement in activism and so on, and in creativity. And that also leaves you unsettled. And it's also one of the few places you can find people who aren't hyper-focused on one thing or swallowed up by the necessities of life. And it gives people like me and like him a chance to think, a chance to interact with all kinds of different people, less so as the bubbles get tighter, and it gives us more of a sense of perspective and nuance than most other people, I think. It sounds a bit like I'm tooting my own horn, but I'm trying to be nice to Nick and say that this is where I think he's coming from. Now, from my perspective, reading what he says, I get the impression Nick is, like me, a rather old-school leftist. You know, why can't we do something about healthcare? Lots of things are better off done collectively, the cheaper, more efficient, more effective, and so on. But he presents his viewpoints, which are quite far to the left in an American perspective, and milquetoast centre-left from a European perspective, but he presents this as centrism, which I don't think it is. I think he's quite left-wing, but he's also a pragmatist. I describe myself as an ideological anarchist, but a pragmatic socialist. That's not socialism as in Marxism, but socialism as its own ideology. You know, central organisation, grouping together makes a lot of economic sense. It is an efficient way to go about things, and I believe that we should all muck in our society to improve everyone's lot. And I get the impression that that's very much where Nick is as well. But he's a pragmatist, not an ideological Puritan. So when he talks about one subject or the other, like healthcare or firearms reform in the States, you can tell that he has an ideological position, but he's thinking about it pragmatically. What can we do? What is the best? What does the science say? What do the statistics say? It's not about the ideological purity, it's about the pragmatic outcome. Now, more than me, perhaps Nick takes a more humanistic approach, but I think we both place that and pragmatism over ideology. You know, he starts out by saying the problem is people. Most people don't have time to think. Most people don't bother to think. Most people don't examine things. You know, they skim the headlines, or they regurgitate the sound bites, or they've been told by someone they trust, then they never bother to check it. You know, these are all predictable human weaknesses and problems that others take advantage of. Now, I tend to think we should shift to a more skeptical and scientific viewpoint, you know, take the advice of experts and so on. Nick seems to be angling more at accepting and understanding that people are like this, and then trying to tailor the message and the ideas and the ideals to appeal to them. Though it's the same ideas and ideals, whereas I'm more suggesting that we need a kind of foundational, critical thinking oriented change in society before we can really get anywhere. So that's where we differ. I think we both agree that a pragmatic approach is more important than ideology. You can look at how the pseudo-left is constantly eating its own, how they'd rather be ideologically pure than to wield power. You can look at the attacks on Bernie Sanders in the US, or the attacks or the excuses given for Labour losing. You know, we'd rather have the moral high ground than be in power and execute even a modicum of our policies. Yeah, it's nice for your conscience. It's less nice for actually achieving your goals and your ends. Of course, at the extreme, you end up then fighting dirty like your opponents, and that would give me pause. But overall, I think pragmatism and using the facts and not getting locked into these ideological purity spirals is more effective. But yeah, he doesn't present himself necessarily as being particularly left-wing. He casts himself as a radical centrist, taking what works from here and there. Pragmatism being against these purity spirals and this ideological demand for absolute concordance with whatever the thought leaders in that particular movement might be in at the time. Yeah, the thing is, right, as the old joke goes, and it wasn't Stephen Colbert who coined it, but reality has a left-wing bias, or a liberal bias, as he'd say in the States. You used to be able to say that proudly, that the left-wing basically essentially had a monopoly on reality. You can't say that so much anymore, because the social sciences and psychology are so tainted, and that's where the left is at the moment, in those areas, rather than pragmatic things like housing reform or welfare reform or instituting or preserving public health care. I think things like that, where you can look at the bald stats, you can look at the examples from other countries in education, healthcare, social investment, teaching, whatever, and you can see that left-wing approaches work in those areas, in the prison system, for example, as well. Instead, it's all in this kind of wild and woolly areas where the research is terrible, overridden by activists, and there's a lot there for other people to pick at and pull at. And for me, Nick's book was incredibly useful because it provides an American perspective. Of course, I spend all day long interacting with Americans. I have an interest in American politics because it influences all of us, perhaps especially here in the UK, especially post-Brexit, with Bojo looking like he's just downing his trousers and buttering up his bunghole, ready for a trade deal. But it's useful to get that American perspective, particularly on things like guns and healthcare, because these topics are just absolutely bewildering to anyone outside the States. Why do you all need a high capacity, high caliber death machine? Are you being attacked by marauding mobs of meth bears? What's going on? Why would anyone need those? Right? And then on the healthcare, surely these go hand in hand. If you're going to have guns going off all over the place, surely healthcare provision should be a priority. And we look at our systems, and for all their problems, they're cheaper, better outcomes, more effective. Everyone gets them. No one is being bankrupted when they get ill. None of that. And you look at the American system, and it just beggars belief. But Nick does a pretty good job of explaining these. And I think like him, I think that guns overall are a negative for the States, but the underlying problem is the violence. Guns are a force multiplier. You could get rid of all the guns, there would still be violence. It just wouldn't be as bad. So it's still worth considering gun reform, gun control, even a gun ban, but that doesn't address the underlying problem. And if you can address the violence, and I think that's due to lack of social investment, education, opportunities, and so on in society, then perhaps you don't need to more tightly control or get rid of the guns. I mean, if I could Thanos snap all the guns out of the US immediately, I would do it in a heartbeat, and I think they'd be better off for it. But there are these underlying issues that really need to be addressed. The problem is that there are a lot of people being driven to violence, and they have access to firearms. But if you can stop them being driven to violence, then maybe things will be a bit better. And then the sheer level of propaganda when it comes to healthcare reform in the States, I think that bears comparison with the sheer amount of propaganda against Europe that we've had for decades that has resulted in this debacle. But most people don't argue, and if they do argue, they're not really doing it in good faith. And you're not really arguing for their sake, you're arguing for other people who are listening who haven't been persuaded either way, as Hitchens always used to say, and it's quoted here as well. Most people just discuss and debate and argue in the form of thought-terminating cliches and catchphrases. There's a couple of things I take more of an issue with here. When he talks about UK violence, for example, in his bit about guns, it fails to take into account that our reporting systems are different, how we track statistics is different, and police are incentivized to kind of inflate the figures. Weirdly, you'd think they'd be incentivized to decrease the figures, but they're being told to get more arrests and so on. And at least up until recently, if 6 people were involved in a gang fight in which knives were involved, each individual person who was charged, each individual act would be registered as a crime, whereas so far as I'm aware in the US they don't do it that way. So that's something that may have well inflated the figures. Plus you can look at the knife violence and so on, and you can say, how much worse would that have been with guns? So I take a little bit of an issue with comparisons to London and the UK there. I also think Nick has a bit of a grandpa moment when it comes to social media and echo chambers and so on. I mean, echo chambers are a problem. Echo prisons are more of a problem, I think. When it comes to social media, we've adapted to other technologies in the past, eventually. During the English Civil War, printed pamphlets were everywhere, full of propaganda, and people just took them at face value a lot of the time, because for a lot of people the only text they ever encountered was the Bible, and so by extension any form of the written word that they encountered took on that kind of authority. But we adjusted to that, and we no longer trust everything that we read. The novel was considered scandalous and unsuitable, and we seem to adjust to that. You look at old pictures of people riding the train to work or whatever, they've all got their heads buried in a newspaper. Of course, the media was more responsible then, a few more checks and so on, proper retractions, proper codes of ethics. You know, they had the money to do all that at the time. But if you look around a phone carriage today and see everyone with their heads buried in their phones, odds are they're socialising with their friends and family, reading something, listening to music, listening to an audiobook. Yeah, it's not necessarily bad. I think where social media has gone wrong is the algorithms. You don't get chronological order. Even on Facebook, of people you're friended, you don't see things in the order that they've been posted. It's all curated by automated systems that tend to create these positive feedback loops that push you into echo chambers and echo prisons, and that's the problem, not social media itself. It didn't used to be like this when it all started up, and even the kind of proto-social media, like the blog networks, like LiveJournal and so on, it wasn't like that either. It's the algorithms, it's the automation, it's these positive feedback loops that are creating the problem, not social media itself. Particularly heart-wrenching was reading Nick talking about how art has lost its value in this society. That this is something I don't seem to be able to get a lot of people to grasp. So much media today is propaganda, and it's crude propaganda at that. Some propaganda can be really beautiful and artistic. I think Soviet realism, their propaganda posters and so on, still has genuine artistic value. But you look at a lot of art today, science fiction, fantasy, comics, TV series, whatever, it's overtly preachy and propagandistic. It doesn't use allegory and storytelling. And if you go back far enough in something like Captain America, of course you'll see him punching Hitler or whatever else the case might be, and that's obvious and blatant propaganda. And really, if you isolate that from its heritage that it's created down the ages, those kinds of comics are shit, poorly drawn, crude stories, crude propaganda, and so on. But that seems to be where comics, just to keep going with this example, are today. I mean, The Orange Man is bad, but can't you do that through allegory, with a sense of humour, with storytelling? Can't we discuss these topics through a filter? The same way that X-Men was about racial tensions and later LGBT issues and so on. Can't we do that? Use it as allegory? But that seems to have been lost. You know, the art of it, saying something without directly saying it, or making a topic relatable in a way that isn't going to trigger people and shut them off from the get-go. And art, the really big issue is that art has lost its immunity. Not immunity to criticism, but its immunity to censorship, to people being hounded, to places that host talks or art shows or whatever being hounded by the social media mob into shutting them down. Even comedy, as Nick notes in the book, has been affected by this. Even comedians, even jesters, can't tell it like it is anymore, or poke fun at things anymore without outrage and censorship. I think we're starting to see this shift, but I've said that before, years ago. It's often felt like there's going to be a change and this is going to stop and the pendulum's going to swing the other way, but every time I've said that before, I've been wrong, and we are overdue for it swinging the other way. And I am also concerned that swinging the other way might mean from one extreme to the other, from not being able to talk about topical issues or sensitive issues to back to the crudeness and the overt racism of like Bernard Manning in the 1970s or whatever. There's got to be some sort of happy medium where context matters, where the framing matters, where we're more forgiving of people while still being careful not to be genuinely, meaningfully offensive and bigoted. There's one last bit I really want to comment on, and when Nick talks about writing, he talks about it as a form of meditation, of isolation, and our processes could not be more different. I need constant stimulation when I'm working, when I'm creating. I need that social media feed there to bounce ideas off people, to go down internet rabbit holes when I'm researching something, and to throw up new ideas. So it's very different, but I do think writing can serve as a meditative process. And artists are often associated with mental illness. It's not true, except for writers, who do have a higher correlation of depression than other artists do with any other forms of madness. So if there are insane people in the artistic community, it tends to be writers. And I do find that my depression is useful in writing. That perfectionism and self-doubt can lead you to constantly polish, to meditate upon, and to deeply think things through before you write them. And I do think the process of writing does that. Not so much necessarily the quickly dashed off hot take on social media, but a blog or a diary or a journal, something more long form, does make you think as you go through it, catch yourself, change your phrasing, that sort of thing. Well, he ends on a more upbeat note, saying that the solution is people, which is, yeah, pretty obviously true. But unfortunately, this section of the book is the most underdeveloped. There isn't like a formula for success, a formula for change. Here, there's a yearning, a longing for more figures to spring up, like the heroes of old, I guess. Everyone has feet of clay, but inspirational figures that can gather people around them, to create that more pragmatic, more tolerant society that I think a lot of people want. But it takes effort, and there isn't really any sort of roadmap here how to do it. But maybe with people like me, like Nick, like others who don't chase the algorithm, who don't grift, who are puzzling and groping our way through the new social context, the new political context. Maybe if there's enough of us, eventually we can get some kind of critical mass. Maybe that'll be enough to try and steer course off these rocks of both the left and right extremes, the absolutism and the ideological purity that you see on both sides. But I'm not holding my breath. Zang. "Rrrr," said the grinder as it chewed its way through Alice, from the crown of her head all the way down to her toes. It ate the lot of her, unfussy, snout to tail, and cleared its plate. It gnashed its way through her dress, her pinafore, her shoes, and her unmentionables. It chewed her hair, devoured her scalp, gobbled up her arms, wolfed down her legs, gorged itself on her torso, noshed on her skin, and gulped her down without so much as a burp to show for it.